This video I'm going to talk about whether one is allowed to practice a certain aspect of Islam without seeing proof of specific requirements to practice that aspect of the religion. For example, if someone like an Islamic scholar were to tell you that you had to break your fast at sunset, and if you were to just go along and believe what they tell you without asking for proof and seeing proof that indeed sunset is the time to break your fast, the question is whether that is allowed or not. In other words, can you just blindly believe what scholars tell you? Can you just defer to scholars without seeing proof yourself as to what these scholars are telling you and encouraging people to do? Now, first of all, according to verse 36 of chapter 17, knowledge is required in order to pursue or practice any aspect of a religion, or the religion of Islam, the Quran. This verse reads, "And do not pursue that of which you have no knowledge. Indeed, the hearing, the sight, and the heart, about all those one will be questioned." Now, the key part of this verse is highlighted in yellow. It says, do not pursue that of which you have no knowledge. So if you do not have knowledge as to, for example, what time you should break your fast, then you need to pursue it and find proof of that. And so if a community, like an Islamic community in an Islamic country, if you just saw everyone breaking their fast at sunset and you just assumed that that was the correct time, well, according to this verse, you cannot do that. You need to see proof. You need to acquire knowledge and see that sunset is or is not the correct time to break your fast. But of course, most people, they're just going to follow what their community does. They just kind of go with the flow. What this verse is indicating is that one needs to pursue, or one needs to acquire knowledge before pursuing anything as it relates to religion. Now, in verse 24 of chapter 47, we find in order to understand and think deeply about the Quran, the verse reads, "Then do they not study, think deeply about, or understand the Quran, or are there locks upon their hearts?" Right, so this verse indicates that one is supposed to study and think deeply about the Quran, and if they don't, then it is as if there are locks upon their hearts. In verse 36 of chapter 10, we read, "And most of them follow not except assumption. Indeed, assumption avails not against the truth at all. Indeed, God is knowing of what they do." So this verse is basically telling people not to assume anything. Now, Muslims would agree that the Quran is the truth, but they don't necessarily verify things that they have been told by reading and understanding the Quran. If someone on YouTube or some Islamic scholar goes and tells them something, then they assume that these Islamic scholars are telling them the truth when the basis of what these scholars are telling them may not necessarily purely come from the Quran, and it could just be purely made up. In verse 67 of chapter 33, we read, "And they will say, Our Lord, indeed we obeyed our leaders and our elders, great men, and they led us astray from the right way." So this verse basically is telling people not to just blindly follow leaders in particular. Okay, so it's not just assuming and blindly following anyone, but it clearly indicates that there are people who just obey and blindly follow leaders in their community and their elders or their great men, when in fact these leaders or great men are leading these followers astray. Okay. In verse 22 of chapter 8, we read, "Indeed, the worst of living creatures in the sight of Allah, or God, are the deaf and the dumb, and who do not use reason." And so, from this verse, you are expected to use reason and to think logically about what it is that you are doing. And I would argue that blindly following people, regardless of whether they look like a scholar or not, is not a necessarily logical thing to do, because, as you probably have noticed, there are many scholars out there, or self-proclaimed scholars, who claim that they know more than you do, or that what they're telling you is correct. And so it is necessary for everyone to see proof for themselves. So, for example, the verses that I'm showing you here are proofs, because they come from the Quran, right? I'm not just telling you these things without showing you the proofs. I'm actually presenting the proofs, and you can come to a conclusion yourself. In verse 44 of chapter 25, we read, or do you think that most of them hear or reason? They are not except like livestock. Rather, they are even more astray in their way. Okay, so here basically it's indicating that people who do not use reason, they are worse than livestock or cattle or cows, right? They're, you could say, dumb. They're just following people without really thinking or using reason. So to conclude, you do have to see proof before practicing any part of the religion of Islam. And the proof is in the Quran, obviously. I mean, in another video, I will go into detail about whether the Quran is the sole source of truth, or if it is okay to take other sources like the Hadith or various fatwas and whatnot. But I think most people would agree that the Quran is the source of truth. And so with this video, I think we can conclude pretty clearly, based on those verses, that one is required to see proof before pursuing any aspect of the religion, and not just assume and blindly believe what scholars may tell them. And so if you have a question about something and you're not sure what the right thing to do is, of course you'll probably go and ask scholars, because they have studied, or supposedly have studied, the religion. But if they just tell you something without giving you proof, then you need to ask them for proof, and you need to see the proof, and you need to understand the proof and see if it makes sense to you. All right. With all of these videos that I make, I'm not asking you to just believe me because of me. I'm actually showing you the proof, and I'm basically saying, you do whatever you want. Here's the proof. If it makes sense to you, then you can believe in it. Otherwise, do whatever you want. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to get notified of more of these videos, hit the subscribe button.